Welcome back to MTG Therapy. In today's video, we're going to be going over the basics of how to play Magic the Gathering. I'm going to be using the Assassin's Creed Starter Kit Play Guide. Every starter kit comes with a play guide. We'll be going through that for all the basics. So first, we'll start with the introduction to the 5 colors. Each of the 5 colors in Magic represents a different philosophy and a different playstyle. The color of the cards in your deck determines which type of land you'll use for resources, also known as mana. White gets the job done with teamwork and balance and will be created by planes. Green is filled with nature's fiercest creatures, the bigger the better, and is created by forests. Red is aggressive and wants to win fast and win now. It's created by mountains. Blue picks apart strategies, then it crushes opponents, and it's created by islands. Black seeks power no matter the cost, and is created by swamps. Next, we'll move on to the play area. So between 2 opponents, this will be the layout. Here you'll have the battlefield. Next to that, you'll have your library. Behind that, you'll have your graveyard, and then you will be holding your hand. So the battlefield will be where you play your mana and also your creatures. This is also where you'll be battling your opponent. You and your opponent share the battlefield. You and your opponent will each have a section that contains cards that you control. Cards that go onto the battlefield, including lands, creatures, artifacts, enchantments, are all called permanents. Instants and sorceries are never on the battlefield. You can arrange your permanents however you want. We recommend putting your lands closest to you, but your opponent must be able to see all of them. Your library is your deck and remains face down throughout the game. You'll be drawing from this throughout the game. You lose the game if this runs out and you are no longer able to draw. In your hand, you'll start with 7 cards. Your graveyard is your discard pile. Creatures that die, sorceries and instants you cast, artifacts, enchantments that are destroyed, and cards you discard from your hand go here. Cards in your graveyard are always face up, and anyone can look at them at any time. Each player has their own graveyard. Let's talk about starting a game. First, you and your opponent will pick a deck and shuffle them. Next, you'll choose at random which player will go first. Normally, I just roll dice to see who goes first. Make sure each player has a way to track their life total. Each player will start with 20 life. Make sure that you protect your life, because if this hits 0, you lose. Now that the game is starting, each player draws 7 cards. You'll want to have a mix of card types in your hand. It's recommended to have at least 2 land cards. If you don't have at least 2 lands in your hand, you'll want to do what's known as a mulligan, where you reshuffle your hand into your deck and then draw 7 more cards. Each place you play has its own rules on mulligan. Some places they'll have you draw 6 the second time, but you'll want to ask if you're unsure. Once both players have decided to keep their hands, the game starts. You will draw a card each turn. The player who goes first doesn't draw a card on their first turn to make up for the advantage of going first. A game of Magic starts with only players' decks and life counters on the table. Players then take turns to play lands, cast spells, and attack with creatures. Let's go over game actions. First, tapping and untapping. Tapping means you turn the card sideways to show that it's been used for the turn. When a card is tapped, you can't tap it again until it's untapped. Untapping means returning a card to its upright position so that you can use it again. As your turn begins, untap your tapped cards. You will usually tap lands, creatures, and cards that have this little symbol. That means tap this card. For example, when you tap a land you control, you turn it sideways and create mana to use for casting spells or paying costs. You won't be able to tap that land again until it untaps. Other types of cards work the same way. Creatures must be untapped to attack, block, or use their tappable abilities. Next, we'll go to casting spells. To cast a spell, you must pay its mana cost, located in the upper right corner of the card, by tapping lands or other permanents to make the amount and type of mana which that spell requires. For example, if you're casting Brotherhood Patriarch, you could tap 3 basic lands of any type to pay for the 3 colorless, plus 1 swamp to pay for the 1 black mana. Once a spell has been cast, one of 2 things happen. If the spell is an instant or a sorcery, you follow the instructions on the card and then you put the card into the graveyard. If the spell is a creature, artifact, or enchantment, you put the card on the table in front of you. The card is now on the battlefield. Cards on the battlefield are called permanents to differentiate them from instants and sorceries, which are never on the battlefield. Combat. Attacking and blocking. The most common way to win a game is using your creatures to attack your opponent. Creatures deal combat damage to your opponent and make them lose life. You get a combat phase in the middle of each of your turns that follow the general steps. Declare attackers. In this step, choose the creatures you want to attack with and then tap them. Creatures that enter the battlefield this turn will have what's called summoning sickness and won't be able to attack. Also, creatures that are tapped can't attack. You can only attack your opponent, you can't attack specific creatures. Next, the person you are attacking will declare blockers. Your opponent will choose their blockers. Tapped creatures can't block. For blocking, it doesn't matter how long a creature has been on the battlefield. The summoning sickness wouldn't have any effect on them. Each untapped creature may block only one attacker, and multiple creatures can team up to block a single attacker. Combat damage. Combat damage is dealt. All attacking and blocking creatures deal combat damage equal to their power. Attackers that weren't blocked will deal damage to your opponent, and they will lose that much life. If your opponent blocked, then the attackers deal combat damage to the blockers, and vice versa. If a creature is dealt damage greater than or equal to the toughness during a single turn, then that creature dies and goes to the graveyard. If an attacker is blocked by multiple creatures, then the attacking player chooses an order for the blocking creatures, and damage will be dealt in that order. When enough combat damage is dealt to the first blocker, it dies, and any remaining combat damage will be dealt to the second blocker. If the second blocker dies, any remaining damage will be dealt to the third, and so on. Any creature that takes less damage than its toughness during a single turn stays on the battlefield, and all that damage wears off at the end of turn. Now let's go over how to read a magic card. There'll be 6 different attributes. You'll have the name, the mana cost, the type line, you'll have the expansion symbol, you'll have the text box, you'll have power and toughness. Name. Each card has a name that serves as its unique identifier. Though a card may be reprinted in many Magic sets, no 2 cards with the same name will ever function differently. In most Magic formats, you can have up to 4 copies of a card with the same name in your deck, except for basic lands, which are unlimited. Mana cost. Mana is used to cast spells in Magic. All spell cards have a mana cost in the upper right corner. Ezio, Blade of Vengeance's mana cost means that you must pay 3 mana of any kind plus 1 blue and 1 black mana to cast it. Type line. Every card in Magic has a type, and some cards also have subtypes or super types. For example, Ezio, Blade of Vengeance's type is creature, and its subtypes are human and assassin. There are 6 standard card types: lands, creatures, artifacts, enchantments, sorceries, and instants. Lands will be used to generate mana. They are the game's primary resource. Creatures fight for you. They can attack during the combat phase of your turn and block during the combat phase of an opponent's turn. You can cast a creature as a spell during your main phase, and it remains on the battlefield until it's destroyed, sacrificed, exiled, or otherwise removed. Creatures enter the battlefield with summoning sickness, which means that a creature you control can't attack or use a tappable ability until it starts your turn under your control. You can block with a creature no matter how long it's been on the battlefield. Artifacts represent machines or magical objects. As with creatures, you can cast an artifact as a spell during your main phase, and it remains on the battlefield unless it's destroyed, sacrificed, exiled, or otherwise removed. Most artifacts are colorless, which means you can cast them with any color of mana, but there are some that require colored mana to cast as well. Enchantments have persistent magical effects that affect the game as long as they're on the battlefield. As with creatures, you can cast enchantments as a spell during your main phase, and it will remain on the battlefield unless it is destroyed, sacrificed, exiled, or otherwise removed. Sorceries are spells that you can cast only during the main phase of your turn. They will only have a one-time effect. You do what the spell says, and then put that card into the graveyard. Instants are spells that can be cast at any time, even during your opponent's turn or during combat. Like sorceries, instants have a one-time effect. You do what the spell says, and then you put it in your graveyard. The text box includes rules text and flavor text. Rules text explains special effects a card has during gameplay. Reminder text can sometimes appear in parentheses, just to clarify how abilities work. Flavor text does not have effect on gameplay, but provides the backstory of the card. Flavor text is always italicized and appears after the horizontal line in the text box. Cards sometimes use keywords to describe certain abilities such as flying, vigilance, and first strike. If you come across a keyword you don't recognize, I recommend just Googling it. Every creature card has a box in the lower right corner that shows its power and toughness. A creature's power, the first number, is the amount of damage it deals in combat. Its toughness, the second number, is the amount of damage that must be dealt to it in a single turn to destroy it. If a creature takes damage but isn't destroyed, it will recover at the end of the turn. Expansion symbol. This symbol tells you which magic set this card is from. Each magic set has its own distinct symbol, and the color of the symbol tells you the card's rarity. You'll have mythic rare, rare, uncommon, and common. Lastly, we'll go over the parts of a turn. Each turn proceeds in the same sequence. Whenever you enter a new phase, the active player, the player whose turn it is, gets to start casting spells and activating abilities. Then each other player can do so in turn order. When all players decline to do anything more, the game moves on to the next phase. Any player may cast instant spells or activate abilities during any player's turn, even if they are not the active player. Beginning phase. First, untap all your permanents. Next, any at the beginning of your upkeep abilities trigger. Next, you must draw a card from your library. The player who goes first does not draw a card on their first turn. If you run out of cards in your library and need to draw one, then you lose the game. First main phase. You can play a land during this phase, but remember that you can only play one land during your turn. Next, you can play any number of cards and activate any abilities as long as you have the mana to pay for them. So this will be when you can play any of your creatures, enchantments, sorceries, or artifacts. Combat phase. So it starts with the beginning of combat step. Then we move to declaring attackers. Next, your opponent will declare blockers, and after that, combat damage will be dealt. Then you'll hit the end of combat step. Second main phase. Your second main phase will be just like your first main phase, and you can cast spells and activate abilities. You can also play a land if you haven't already this turn. Ending phase. This is where any at the beginning of your end step abilities will trigger. At this point, if you have more than 7 cards in your hand, you must discard until you only have 7. And lastly, all damage on creatures is removed, and all until end of turn effects end. And that will be the basics of how to play Magic. I hope this is able to help anyone that's trying to get into Magic or just starting. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.